Good afternoon, everyone. We're in the committee of the whole meeting for Tuesday, May 15th. Somebody's birthday. Halton's following. We still doing Squamish. Oh, well, now, welcome to the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. And as I said, it is Councillor Elliott's birthday. Happy birthday. Thank you very much. Happy birthday. First up, looking for a motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Councillor Black-and-Wolf, seconded by Councillor Kent. All those in favor? Opposed, if any? Motion carries. We have our zoning update priorities conversation and nothing else.
Thank you. My name is Matt Gunn. I'm a planner with the District of Squamish.
Velaniskis, Director of Community Planning.
I am here to to come back to an item that we have discussed previously at the last meeting when we discussed the zoning bylaw update. Council had asked that we come back with some specific information around the priority items that were identified, and more specifically information around the complexity of getting them prepared, the level of engagement that might be required, and the level of engagement we might receive from the community on the topics in order to identify which ones were appropriate to address in the short term in the coming 4 or 5 month period. There are a number of items that I'm going to discuss. I won't read them out because we'll be going through them shortly, but these are the priority items we've talked about, and I will go through them individually. What's going on? The screen is not.
I think you bought a few options.
So don't give
PowerPoint's open.
extend.
Oh, okay, okay. Apologies.
That's okay.
We're opening the game here.
While you're futzing,
Yes. Futzing.
I'll just update council on, you ready?
But I can.
That's right. We can, I just thought I'd fill the empty space.
Okay. So on the screen are the priority items that were discussed at the previous meeting. We'll go through these individually and talk about those elements. So the first one that was a priority item was alignment of the zoning with the OCP land designations. In terms of getting this done in a short time period, it probably will be fairly challenging to achieve prior to October. There's a fairly comprehensive analysis that would be a significant task to do in the short run. The amendments to zoning to reflect the land use designations could generate a fair bit of attention from landowners, and because of that, it probably would be worthwhile having some fairly significant engagement undertaken as part of that process. So these ones weren't identified by staff as probably appropriate for a very near-term implementation.
I just want to go to Robin quickly, just because we are between third reading and adoption on the OCP. We can't really talk much about the OCP. That's I just wanted to make sure everyone was appreciative of that. Councillor Rayson.
Thank you. This is the one I didn't understand. Do you have an example? So I take it what we're doing is changing the zoning of some of the lands we've already identified for certain uses in the OCP or the draft OCP. And I'm not talking about the draft OCP. So that, do you have an example of that? What any parcel might have to be redesignated?
Or rezoned.
Or rezoned?
Yeah, so off the top of my head, I don't have a bunch of the specifics where we have mismatches. An easier one to talk about would be areas where we do want to achieve sub-area planning, and current zoning does not ensure that sub-area planning would occur. So trying to change the zoning so that it would ensure that rather than just get a subdivision application for a broad swath of land at a particular density, that a sub-area plan would have to happen for that larger parcel. That's one example.
Yeah, there's a number of lots downtown that have historic zoning, and so we would, rather than rezoning them, upzoning them, we would have to, figure out a solution that is based on density bonusing or a holding zone or something.
To align with the OCP.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, Gary has pointed out another fairly easy one to talk to. There are a number of properties in the downtown area that are zoned industrial that we don't necessarily want to see become industrial, and so that would fall into that category where Probably they're going to have some type of use that incorporates residential. We don't necessarily want to do that right away, but one of the options would be to put it into holding zone so that we don't get an industrial use, but we do have the ability to talk about what use it would go into over time.
Okay, thanks, that's helpful, thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions on that? So that sounds like a significant
It is.
project and quite strategic in a lot of ways, so it's a big.
And potentially contentious on some of the.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so it deserves the time to engage with owners on that. A high priority item, but not appropriate in this time frame. Okay. Any other questions on that one? Missing middle housing is an element that we want to try and address, and it was identified in the official community plan. We've got, and there is a table, an Excel sheet at the back of the agenda that was provided to council, or the agenda item, and it's identified a number of regulatory changes that staff are proposing could be made to incorporate missing middle housing forms into RS zones. This is something that we think could be drafted. The complexity of drafting is not that high, so from staff preparing the document or the zoning changes would be reasonable within the short term. There is some impacts that will increase density and change neighborhood character, and so that could generate some community involvement and concern. So some level of community engagement is certainly appropriate, but it is one of the items that is a high priority that does seem reasonable to try to address in the short term. But the one thing to keep in mind is, there may be some response from certain neighborhoods on the potential impacts to community character.
Karen?
Just looking at that table at the back, one of the bullet points caught my eye, and around the missing middle.
Yeah.
And it's the second or the third in the whole table, missing middle, and this actually limits on size on single family homes.
Yeah.
But there's the second bullet that says reduce incentive to demolish and rebuild.
Yes.
Why?
I can explain that. This one came from some research that staff has done. I think it's Eugene, Oregon, that's using this approach to address missing middle. One thing that they're experiencing is smaller lots, smaller homes, more affordable homes, are getting torn down and replaced with very large homes. And in certain areas, they are reducing the maximum size that homes can be constructed to do two things. One, the home that's built is less expensive, but two, there's less profit to be gained by tearing down an existing home and building with a much larger and more valuable home. And so it also achieves preserving more of the homes that are of that character.
It's interesting because we actually want more homes built to a higher standard. So
Trade-offs.
it's a big trade-off.
Yes.
So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, and we've tried to outline what are the things that could be considered, not necessarily saying that council is going to want, assuming that council is going to want to support all of these, but these are the options that we have tried to look to that could try and achieve some of these goals.
Any further questions or comments, Jason?
Yeah, I saw this and I'm just wondering, what the mechanism would be for sort of two things. So, if we did a blanket rezoning, or to combine the RS1 and RS2, one would assume that would actually cause a bit of speculation to occur, like where the lot values actually would go up in value significantly. So I'm just wondering what would be the best way that we could deal with that, because I've definitely been on the record as saying that the RS2 zoning that we have up in Brackendale is actually a pretty good form in terms of allowing for flexibility over time and different family sizes and having smaller builders be able to be in the market, which is definitely something we want. So just wondering about that, and then also, would we be looking at amending our DCC bylaw so that if somebody is going to go from single family home to duplex, are we still going to be able to collect some DCCs? Because normally that's only done at rezoning stage. And is there a way to put that in the fee schedule.
Just to clarify, are we talking about CACs or DCCs?
DCCs.
DCCs. I think if you're going for a single unit to a duplex or a triplex, we recognize that you've only paid for one unit, so we would at that time charge for the additional.
Okay.
DCCs aren't at rezoning, only CACs are.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
DCC would be charged a building permit.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, that answers that question.
Yeah, Matt.
Mayor Heinzman, the first component of your question was about, I guess, the unintended consequences of increasing the permitted uses on RS1, RS2 by collapsing them, and I think it's a good point, and it is one of the consequences. Lot value would go up. Hopefully, the concept is that the unit values would go down, and so it's again a trade-off. Land value will go up, but if we have duplexes and on corner lots, one of the options would be to just outright allow triplexes on corner lots. Hopefully those units would come down in value and achieve more mixed forms within communities. So it's some trade-offs to be contemplated for sure. And I can't say that we've done extensive analysis to contemplate what the magnitude of those impacts would be, but it's something to be cognizant
Yeah,
of.
and all that being said, I mean, definitely I can see how this approach has definitely some inherent advantages over our existing sort of model where, you know, condo developer or townhouse developer assembles a couple of lots and then has to go through the whole rezoning and, you know, more intensified process. So anything that has a shorter turnaround time, I think is definitely something we should be looking at.
Doug.
Interesting. I remember questioning this missing middle thing. It was last year, and I missed the 2 meetings where it was discussed, and so I didn't.
Doug, I'm gonna put you on hold for a second, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Karen. Happy birthday to you. We figured since you have to suffer through a birthday with us, we should at least brighten it. And Terry had to go get a gluten-free something, so you're all good.
Which one?
Eat the whole thing.
That was the chocolate.
Except the things on the top, but yeah.
And what one's that?
That one's a strawberry something. So,
Raspberry white chocolate.
Raspberry with chocolate.
why don't we finish the zoning bylaw and then we'll have a little.
It'd be very difficult.
That's a good incentive, I think.
Keep your focus.
You gotta get through this conversation.
Doug.
Yeah, this will only be about a half-hour comment. But as I look there, you know, and this missing middle idea, I mean, I look at the different forms of housing there, and we have examples of all of them in Squamish right now in some degree or another throughout the different developments. And so I guess for me, and maybe this is a discussion when the bylaw comes forward, is whether we expect to find these housing forms within every small neighborhood, or whether is that in the municipality generally. Because the whole of Squamish, for example, would comprise maybe one small neighborhood of, say, a city like Vancouver. And they could say, yeah, over that kind of a vast thing, you'd like to see different examples of housing. Here our neighborhoods are considerably smaller, and would we necessarily expect to see all of this in 1 or 2 city blocks, for example? So I guess it's maybe more the discussion later, but I think that's one of the, when I looked at this, and missing middle may be just a misnomer actually, it's more like more middle housing types, because they're all here in some form. And whether or how much you actually intend to go into a particular neighborhood and say you've got to have more of this, this, and this, or is it over a larger area? Are we talking about the whole of Brackendale or part of Brackendale, for example? Are we talking about the whole of Highlands or part of the Highlands? And, you know, I won't go on about this, but I think you get the point that what is the neighborhood? How big an area do you want to see an example of each one of these types of housing? So anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
And just to build on that, and I'll go to Ted. For me, I mean, we have bungalows, but we haven't had anything built in 20 years that's bungalows. So for the last 20 years, we haven't had any one-floor, seniors-oriented bungalow courts. They haven't been built. We have them in town, but they were built 20 years ago. and some of these other forms as well. For me, the missing middle is not getting these homogeneous neighborhoods where this is all duplex or this is all townhome, that you have integration of all these different housing forms within neighborhoods to make the neighborhoods more diverse. Particularly in brand new neighborhoods where we don't have anything, that's a little easier to achieve. The question is, how do you take an area like Brackendale that's currently mostly zoned RS2 and develop opportunities for row houses, for which are a little bit different than townhomes, for bungalow courts, or, you know, how do we create those opportunities within the zoning so that people can have some choice on, you know, like maybe it's lots over a certain size can put a bungalow on it and subdivide. So, but you can't subdivide if you're putting a big house. So we get some more of that type of form. I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head right now, but how do we create those opportunities that people can maximize or see value on their land, but we get more than just building to the envelope and putting something massive on there and align the price of land with the opportunity that's really there, not the maximum opportunity that people see. Head.
Yeah, thanks. Well, Brackendale is a perfect example of how you could get the missing middle because there's all those big lots out there. So the big lots could be. I think when the neighborhood plans come out, as they come out, then you ask the neighborhood where they want these missing middle or added density. You know, like the one up in the Highlands where we had that single lot subdivision that didn't get passed. And it was, a lot of the neighbors go, oh my God, I don't want to see my neighborhood subdivided. And I think there's some validity to some neighborhoods not being subdivided. If you take missing middle, which means adding density to single family, I would think that we'd want to do it near all the neighborhood plots. You just take all the stores, go a ring out, 2 rings out, okay, missing middle to this density, missing middle to this density. But as far as saying opening up, well, let's open up the Highlands and say anybody in the Highlands now can turn their single family home into a 3-plex. That's missing middle. Well, I think you'd make a lot of people unhappy on some of those neighborhoods that are well established and landscaped, and people are comfortable with their single family homes. So I think we definitely have to target areas in neighborhoods.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor this, but I think, and that I was going to mention more or less the same thing. I think there's a significant difference between re-engineering an existing neighborhood and talking about something that's brand new, where you have the flexibility of dealing with street parking and all kinds of things to accommodate this type of housing. And so there is a significant sensitivity to re-engineering. Not that it can't be done, but I think there is a sensitivity to try to go back and re-engineer an existing neighborhood. And the neighborhood plan process, I think, is maybe one way of dealing with that on a neighborhood basis to see what the appetite is for the neighbors. In places like Brackendale compared to other subdivisions, for example, where the lots are historically, some of the lots are historically a lot larger, can lend itself to that. So anyway, I don't want to get too far into this at this point, but I think those are some of the concerns I have about this particular one.
Any other questions on this one? And if somebody in the audience wants to ask a question, just put your hand up and come on. Anything else on this one?
No. And just, I guess, for format of this discussion, I'm going to go through each of those points, and at the end I've collected the ones that are probably the most suitable for approach in the short term, and perhaps at that point we could get a consensus from council or direction from council on each one, which one is worth pursuing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just a general comment on this. When I went through this when I was reading the report, one of the things that struck me is, and I don't want to talk about the draft OCP, but there are these precursors.
Don't.
Am I going to? So the question was about the zoning bylaw. And at what point would we tick off zoning bylaw amendments to satisfy a precursor? So are all of the ones that are listed here necessary to do before you could say to that, or are there some yes and some no? and maybe you can think about that, we can talk about at the end, but as we go through it. I mean, I looked at the marine strategy, for example, and I think, well, look, I'm really invested in that, want to see it happen, but does that really have anything to do with gross boundary issues? So,
To that, I would suggest that when council has decided that they've addressed the regulations for missing middle that they're interested in and supportive of, that precursor would be satisfied. So, I think if we initiate a discussion, we propose some regulatory changes and council decides on which ones they want to implement, that would be that precursor satisfied. That is my impression on that. But it would be up to council to decide.
Okay, let's move on.
Moving on.
I'm sorry, that was a kind of a fine line there.
Yeah.
Employment space. One of the pieces that was in the high priority items was to clarify the various industrial zoning distinctions that we currently have in the zoning bylaw. I think in the short term that would be a challenging process. That is going to actually be a fairly complex bylaw drafting to ensure that we get the right mix of uses between the various categories and the right regulatory structure for those. And I also think that's going to require a fairly significant level of engagement with stakeholders. We're not necessarily experts in some of the aspects of an industrial land use that we would want to rely on some of our stakeholders to help us understand. So I see that as being challenging to do in the short term. Another element in employment space that was discussed was permitting additional height and floor area ratio in some of the industrial zones, and that is a less challenging process in terms of both drafting and in terms of engagement with the community. I think that is not going to encounter significant challenges. So I see that as being easy to address in the short term.
Council agrees, I don't see a hand. Thank you.
Creation of new zones was another piece that's been discussed. For the marine zones that are proposed and for agricultural zones, those elements are going to be addressed as part of existing processes. The marine strategy is leading us to zones for marine areas. Proposed ag planning will help determine the agricultural zones. So those aren't really ones that are appropriate or possible to address in the short term. Separately, ecological conservation zoning and a groundwater protection zone are likely quite achievable in the short run. The complexity is probably not too great for us to draft, and I think the engagement, because we're talking about for the ecological zones, areas that are already under some type of management plan or existing provincial designation, those should be fairly straightforward to rezone, and the groundwater protection zone, I think, is not going to encounter significant complications in putting in place.
Agreed. And why is it got really cold in here? Am I feeling wrong?
You're probably cooling off.
The next item is got a fair bit of complexity to it, and I'll try to keep it simple, but there's a fair bit of complexity in this one. One of the high priority items was to try and ensure that the zoning for the university reflects the Sea to Sky University sub-area plan. There's a number of elements in that zoning that are, one, the zone is actually, it's not a very well drafted zone, to be perfectly honest. And also it does not effectively implement a number of the considerations that were set up initially in the sub-area plan and then put onto a covenant that's on a few of the parcels in the university area as an implementation piece. But those aren't necessarily reflected in the zone, and there is a risk in staff's opinion that some of the intentions of the sub-area plan could be lost if we don't have zoning that reflects some of the elements. And so it is a fairly complex situation up there, and I've tried to research it and understand it as well as possible and make some recommendations that I think will help us achieve those elements of the sub-area plan. And so the elements that we've got are One, to start moving away from single and 2-unit dwelling development to multifamily, and potentially removing the single unit, 2-unit dwellings as permitted uses in that area. Add a maximum residential floor area, which does not currently exist in the zoning. Rezone land to accommodate a park, a school site, and a neighborhood commercial node. These are elements that are identified in the sub-areas plan as important, but we don't have areas that are in the zoning well established for those uses. Another piece, which is getting even more into kind of a complex landscape, is to try and allocate our total dwelling unit density to parcels within the university lands. Currently, there is a cap of 960 units for the land, for the entire sub-area plan. However, it is a total cap, and that land is owned by multiple landowners plus the university institution. And as it currently sits, there is, I think, a bit of a feel of a first past the post or a tragedy of the commons situation where those units could be consumed by landowners. And so it almost is creating a conflict. It appears that it's currently being managed by a set of private agreements outside of the zoning and the sub-area plan, which is outside of the scope of council. And in some ways that removes discretion from council and how units are being allocated. And so to me, that is not an optimal situation. And also the 960 itself is that the right number for that area, or is there a possibility that more units would be appropriate in that area? So there's kind of many, it's a complex kind of landscape. I don't necessarily think the current setup is appropriate. And so what we would like to try and do is to find a allocation of those units that respects the historical agreements and the historical expectations, but also provides council with the discretion to decide on how any units above and beyond what are already assumed or expected get allocated across that landscape. And then there's a bunch of housekeeping to try and add some land use certainty to elements in the zoning which don't currently exist because of the way it's drafted.
I have just a clarification question, then I got Ted and Peter. Is there a land development agreement or some sort of development agreement on these lands, or was there a time limit to this 960 unit sub-area plan? Like, is it written in stone? Can we change it? Is there a time limit? Like the ocean plan has a 20-year time limit.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and, I have spent a fair bit of time trying to understand the situation, and I will try to explain to the best of my ability. If I make mistakes, apologies, because it is not easy to fully sort through. But so what we know is that in both our sub-area plan and I believe in our zoning, it says that 960 is the maximum number of units that should be in that area.
And that's in LDA or something?
No, it's in the sub-area plan. Is it in the zone?
I don't think it's in the zone.
Oh, maybe
it's in the sub-area plan.
It's in the sub-area plan for sure. And
but there's, what I'm trying to get at, there's no legal, I'm not saying we're going to do this, but there's no legally binding thing that requires us to stay with that zoning?
So we do not have, we are not bound by anything that in terms of the regulatory structure. The only thing is in our zoning, or in our sub-area plan, which we could address. I believe what is happening is that as lands have been purchased by individuals or groups, foundations, yes, or from foundations to developers, that as part of those agreements, the 960 has been allocated to those new areas, and a set of, in some instances, those new properties have covenants on them so these are private covenants, and they do not name the district as on the covenants. So they're private agreements between foundations and developers that prescribe those limits. And in other situations, I believe there are probably agreements or understandings between foundations and landowners about how those units should be allocated, but they do not, none of them incorporate the district. As to my understanding, there are no legal mechanisms or regulatory structures that we are bound to.
So
but
they've all carved off their own.
They've carved off, and it appears that people are respecting, as people are developing, or individual units are developing those units, they are respecting this structure that exists outside of the district to allocate those lands between the various parcels.
So hypothetically, if we said all of a sudden that we wanted to increase the units to 1,200, the number, and we set some parameters around that in terms of the type of housing, you know, I'm being hypothetical here, 100 are row houses and 50 are cottages, and we could do something like that, and then a developer in theory could bonus density for that extra we've allocated. Could we do something like that?
Yeah, so my understanding is that we are able to do that, but that a set of private agreements and covenants that exist outside of our jurisdiction would actually, currently it appears that developers are respecting those, and despite what we may or may not say are reasonable numbers that people can build, that because there are these outside contractual agreements, that those are being respected. And I think what we need to do is find buy-in from all of the existing groups, so that there isn't this fear of, because the 960 exists, I believe that these allocations are being respected because there's a fear of things getting overconsumed and certain lands becoming less valuable if they get overconsumed elsewhere.
And to Pete, Doug.
Is the sub-area plan being followed?
Well, so the sub-area plan is fairly loose, and elements of, I believe the sub-area plan for the most part could still be implemented, but there are elements that are expected in the sub-area plan that we have not seen yet. So one is a large neighborhood park that is available as an amenity to the people in the area, and that park has the opportunity to either become a school owned by the school district, or if they relinquish it, it becomes all a park owned by the municipality. And that has not been, there isn't zoning or any designation that's been established for that. What there is a covenant that was put on two of the largest parcels, the Block A, which is in the northern half of the property, and the university lands. A covenant was put on that was intended to be an implementation piece for details that weren't sorted out in the sub-area plan, and it identifies where that park should be. And what I'm proposing is that the district should go ahead and zone that land so that that covenant is implemented in our own regulatory structure, and so that doesn't get consumed. One other piece I should add is that covenant does have some other stipulations that have been missed. So one of them is that before a certain number of units are developed, there should be an evaluation as to whether or not there needs to be facilities for firefighting on the campus, and we have passed that number, I believe, without that having been discussed or achieved. And I don't know why all of this has happened, and I have to admit that this is not all easy to understand all of the history, but there are elements of that covenant that aren't being achieved, which is why at this point I think it's important that we take some steps to ensure that those implementation pieces are put into place.
Well, I mean, I agree. Now what about the numbers of housing types? In the sub-area plan, is there 900 and so many units, so many single families, so many multifamily? Is that being followed?
Yeah, so it allocates ranges of percentages for single family versus multifamily, and we have not, a lot of single family has been developed, but we have not passed the bottom end of that threshold. So it's still possible for that allocation to be done as per the sub-area plan. The one problem is that as the land has been consumed in the area, the land that is the easiest to develop land is what has been getting consumed. And so as time goes on, how much of the land is going to be able to be developed is unknown at this point, and whether or not all of the land is going to be able to fulfill all of the elements of the sub-area plan there's some question. I don't know the answer to that.
Unknown by us.
Wait, one more thing, just on that, the residences, are they included at all in the number?
The student residences? The student residences are allocated to the university campus lands, which has no allocation for private development.
No.
And in fact, the allocation for student residences is probably much higher than will ever be achieved, because it was based on the number of students expected. But having talked to the university president, students share residences and they don't each need a private residence. So I think.
But they're not included in the 900?
They're not included in the numbers,
Just
and
wanna
there's
make
no
sure that
problem
was clear
achieving
to
that.
everybody.
Yeah.
And then So, based on all the landowners and some of the discussions going on up there as to, you know, I bought this land and I'm supposed to get this many single-family units. Do we put a stop on things until we get this sorted out?
So I think any applications that are underway fit within the
No, I'm not talking about what's underway, I'm
Oh, sorry.
talking about at some point on, we go, okay, the brakes are on here until we get all this figured out, because the last park site might disappear and we'll get a park on the side of the cliff.
Right. Yeah, I think actually if council directs staff to implement some of these items that I've outlined here, in a very near term, we can allocate based on the existing covenant, the land that was identified for park, and ensure that that land is not going to consume. I think at a future point, should one of the landowners that has that land come in and say, hey, we're still happy to do this, but we could do it in another location, that could be a rezoning process, council could decide what is appropriate. But I think we should set aside, there's one really kind of clear flat area that would be good for a school park, and
So
you know, I think we
when
should.
does council have to make that decision?
If council gives direction to staff at this meeting, we can begin the drafting of that bylaw, and I believe, you know, some of these elements are probably not that hard to do. Some of them may, you know, I've said expectation low to moderate for community involvement and engagement. It may be that as I learn more and talk to more stakeholders, some elements may get harder to achieve, but some, like saying the covenant says this is a park or a school, I think those are very reasonable to achieve within the timeframe that we were talking about.
So I think we should do that now, today, I don't know if you want to do that.
Well, let's finish the conversation, but I think at the end of this, we'll have some decision points listed. Pete and then Doug.
I do agree with that on that one. Excuse me, so out of that 960, does that include units built thus far?
The 960 would include the private units that have built so far, which are a mix of some multifamily, which are being used by students now that will be marketed eventually, and some, and many single family homes. But yes, those are
And
included.
vortexes, and there's a whole bunch of different forms of it.
Yeah, yeah.
So what would the remainder be then? Out of the 960, what's left?
Okay, if we approximately, if we assume that everything that's been proposed, subdivided, including Legacy and University Heights is built out as expected, then I believe it's in the neighborhood of around 500 units left, which predominantly should be multifamily to achieve the vision of the separated plan. I think it might be a little less than 5, but it's in around there.
Left.
Left, I believe so, yeah.
The challenge is there's not a lot of land
And the land is getting steeper
that
now.
would be
and harder to access.
developable left. So a lot of this land was consumed by the single family subdivision.
Yeah, what remains, some of what remains it does not have access or has riparian issues. Some is very hard to get to because it's across a ravine, and others areas are very steep or have topography.
Thanks.
Doug?
Yeah, interesting, because I remember a presentation that came to the Rotary Club. The developers came years ago. At the time, Quest was sort of in the formative stages, and they were talking about residential development, which included multifamily towers, literally towers, 8, 10, 12 stories. So that obviously takes up a lot less per unit in land, and so I can see how it's going to be constrained a little bit from now on. My question, though, is actually, are these covenants that you spoke about, are they actually registered on title? Even a private covenant would have to be registered on title. So we can check out and see how it's supposed to lay out, at least as far as the different landowners go.
I can answer that. So what appears to happen is as properties have been purchased from existing foundations by developers, covenants are registered at that time, giving the allocation for those areas. So areas that are being developed now or under consideration, they have covenants on title that do the allocation. The remaining lands that are still owned by foundations do not have those covenants on title. And so it's a bit of a guesswork to understand how that allocation is laid out between those. There are some clues, but that 500, it is not in any covenants right now on those lands between the remaining. I think there are agreements that those landowners have or those foundations have, but those are not on title.
Sort of, I'm just trying to figure out, going back to being a lawyer, how that would actually work out. And so it's something like a building scheme, enforceable not by the district, but by those. And if we, in a zoning process allocated more or less, it would be interesting what the ripple effect might be. So whether somebody else suffers and would care, or doesn't suffer and might not care. If we thought one area was suitable for more density, for example.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so my approach, my thought on that one is to engage the landowners, understand their expectations, give them the allocations that are expected within the 960 so that there is no fear of loss of allocation. And then I think ideally it would be great if they released or ended that set of outside agreements that are controlling the allocation, and then it would release the district to then consider each site as appropriate, what's appropriate for development on that, should it be increased, without the landowners feeling like they're being threatened or losing from those discussions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And just my final point is, and I agree with Councillor Pryor, I think this would be a good time, not this instant, but at this meeting, to give staff that instruction, because if I understand the process correctly, that means anything coming in subsequent to that is bound by the new as opposed to the old system. So we'll kind of set the mark for considering new applications. So I think that's an important thing.
Yeah,
We've done that before, right?
Yeah.
Jonas is looking
Yes,
at me with looks.
I want to clarify that today we weren't going to recommend that council make a motion for that pause for applications.
Not a pause, but for staff to come back and bring,
Bylaws in preparation.
yeah,
Okay.
and so anything, an application coming in after today would be subject to the new regime that might come back to us, as opposed to the old
Which
regime.
kind of, in a way, puts a bit of a pause, because they won't know what they're building towards. Anyway, think about that.
Yeah, I want to add one, if possible, one last thing. My hope is that we can find a way to have agreement amongst the existing
That's the goal.
landowners. If that becomes challenging, this process to do in a short term will probably be, elements of it will become impossible in the short run. There are elements that I think are worth pursuing that we can do, but depending on how discussions go with the existing landowners, there may be some challenges.
Okay.
well, to the allocation of lots, right now we have the foundations allocating to the developers that they're selling to.
Yes.
So when you're talking about, there's steep land up there, there's lands that aren't adequate for some of the things that are in the suburban land. So if the foundation says, well, I'm going to sell you that 10 acres and I'm going to allocate 100 single-family homes on that. And that might be the last flat spot there is for the park or for the school or for, so, that's where I have my issue. It's like, the foundation's up there. And I've tried to figure out what was going on up there, and it's really a bit of a cluster. And so,
Thank you for your restraint.
well, I did try. I had some students come to me, and so I went in and I had to leave it up to staff. I can't deal with that. I don't know how even council can deal with it, but I know that I just feel that the university's character is at stake if we don't get those amenities or whatever it is in the summary plan.
Okay. I think the form of housing is not an issue. We can do that in the short term. That's not the more complex element. So if the district takes out the single family or two family dwellings out of the zoning and there's a private agreement, we wouldn't be issuing building permits for single family. So those private agreements would be impacted, and I think we're not as concerned about that as getting the allocations right to start out.
That makes sense.
And if I could add one piece, I think one of the really critical pieces is ensuring that the land for the park, the school, those elements, I think those we can do to ensure that, and the commercial, I think we can approach those ones without as much complexity. And I think that's something that's very reasonable to do that would have a big impact on the long-term kind of livability and atmosphere up there, and I think appropriate in the short term.
Okay. Let's just park university, and I think we're going to speak to a couple of specific outcomes at the end of the conversation. I just want to get through all that.
Energy efficiency items, there were a few items that were related to energy efficiency in the high priority items. A proposed density structure was one of them. These regulations would be fairly complex to draft and take some staff resources, and we also are going to want to do some engagement with stakeholders on this to make sure that we do get it right. And so I think this one is something that is probably going to take longer than the short-term time frame we're talking about. But there are a number of energy efficiency items that are reasonable, or energy-related items that are reasonable to approach. Permitting vehicle charging throughout the community, amending the current height and accessory dwelling unit size bonus to reflect the new step code. And also there's an issue around the gross floor area calculations that can penalize additional installation in homes, and I think we can address that, and then a couple of housekeeping items. So I think those ones are quite reasonable to address in the short term.
Any questions about that? Okay.
With hazard areas, there are some housekeeping amendments that are, again, reasonable to address in the short term. One is around clarifying the definition for habitable area. We want to synchronize the zoning regulation. What's that?
Date of death.
Yeah, exactly. We want to synchronize the definition in zoning bylaw with floodplain bylaw, not currently synchronized. That's something that is important from building's perspective, and I think we can do that in a short run. There are some other pieces where we propose that there should be some restrictions on permitted structures and densities in certain high hazard areas, restricted densification areas, and Cheekeye fan areas that are highest hazard areas. This could be drafted in the short term, but there is likely going to be some significant interest and involvement from affected landowners, and so engagement is probably warranted in those, and that could be a bit more complex and maybe perceived negatively if it's tried to be attempted in the short run. Any questions on those ones?
No.
Okay.
Don't see anything.
Secondary suites, this is an evolving regulatory landscape for the district, and so there's a number of housekeeping amendments that staff have identified that would support the secondary suite program, clarification to definition and size limits, some synchronization across bylaws. One that's a concept that could promote or support the development of secondary suites is a reduction of the front setback in the RS zone to allow for more space for secondary suites or carriage homes in the backyard. Ensuring vehicle access is provided to a carriage home style building. These are all a suite of smaller changes that would support secondary suite construction. We think that's reasonable to do in the short term, and probably does not require significant community engagement or have a big response from the community. There are some other elements to secondary suites addressing the height and massing, which have had some impacts and led to concern from community members that we would like to address to improve the compatibility of secondary suites within neighborhoods. This is probably going to involve an increased level of community engagement and consideration and take a bit more time to draft, and so that's probably going to take more time than the short-term time frame that we have. That's our expectation.
Did we amend the zoning bylaw in our last update to not allow short-term rentals in secondary suites?
Yes, we clarified that. It was already not permitted, but I think we clarified that it is.
And then are we scheduled to look at short-term rentals this year?
Yes,
Supposed to be coming back fairly soon, isn't it?
we are. We're working on it. We have a team of people that are looking at it. But I think our recommendation is to separate the two from the zoning bylaw update as a separate project, just given the nature of engagement, but it is coming back later this year.
Okay. It'd just be nice to have those amendments done when we're thinking about this as well.
Yeah, the biggest, or one of the bigger factors with the vacation rentals will be the enforcement and compliance piece, which I think is going to have to dovetail with the next budget, because we have to resource it.
Doug Vinton?
Yeah, it was my understanding that these short-term rentals, less than a month, were not permitted uses in any of the residential areas before this whole thing even blew up. It's just never been part of it. So it's not just the secondary suites, it's also principal residences.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any clarification needed around that, but I mean, it is the status quo, I think, and has been for decades, really.
It is on paper that, but in reality, there are
No, yeah, absolutely,
plus.
it's the enforcement
Yeah.
side, and when are we prepared to take the step?
Yeah, exactly.
Ted?
Well, I'd love to get into that conversation, but I know not now. Access, address height and massing of accessory dwellings. So, in other words, shrink them down, improve compatibility with the neighborhood. And I know, someone builds a carriage house out in the back and the neighbor goes, oh my God, he's looking at my backyard. And so then, so then we shrink that down, then the neighbor builds one. You know what I mean? So that's a slippery slope. We go for carriage houses or not. And so, anyway.
Yeah, to respond to that, yeah, I think to get this right, there are some examples that we can look to. City of Vancouver has spent a bunch of time working on regulatory structures for what are they called, laneway houses. So I think there's some good information out there to draw from. You're trying to find the sweet spot that's going to limit the neighborhood conflict, but still enable the production or the addition of these units to the community. I think is going to take some fine tuning and some effort.
We go, okay, we're going to give you more square footage if you build a smart tiny home or carriage house. So instead of 500, it goes up to 750. And we're going to say, but we're going to have to address the height and massing. It just sounds kind of contradictory.
Yeah,
And
it's one of these trade-offs that's going to be challenging to balance, and why we're probably, at least on our initial kind of evaluation, why staff is feeling that this is probably going to take a bit more time to get right.
And in Vancouver, when they do the houses above the carports, they're 3 feet off the property. They share the sidewalk going through. The two houses will share the sidewalk. I mean, that's how close they are in a lot of cases. And right on the property line in the back alley.
No?
I don't think we're suggesting that we would recommend reducing the sizes of what's allowed now. It's just putting a bit more thinking around how those structures impact the neighbors.
And then really, I mean, it's downtown with the increase in flood elevations. And also, if you wanted to have a workspace in your carriage house in the carport at the bottom, it's nice to have that extra height. I don't know, I think, as long as this doesn't hold up people who are wanting to build carriage houses.
Yeah, we're proposing, looking at this over the next while, but not stopping the production or the approval of carriage houses. And you're right, in some ways there's a question like, are we just willing to accept that some people are going to feel some impact from carriage houses being built there?
I think the biggest item up there is vehicle access. If we eliminate vehicle access for carriage houses, there'll be a flood of carriage houses.
Yeah, this proposal is actually to say we have to make sure that if it's a true carriage house built over a garage, that a car can actually get to it, as opposed to, well, there's a garage door there, but actually a car can't get there, to make that a mandatory element.
And that would, eliminating the access by vehicle to carriage houses would tenfold the amount of carriage horses we have now. And in some areas, you could bring them back down to earth, not have them on a carport, but keeping them on the carport also gives a workspace.
Ted? No, Doug? I looked at Doug and I said Ted.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because, Councillor Pryor is right over Vancouver. I grew up in Vancouver, but most of Vancouver has lanes. And so the carriage houses can be back on the lane and you don't necessarily abut the adjoining property, because significant aspect of these is the impact on the neighboring property. And I can think of a variance we had, I think it was last term, where a person who was building the carriage house wanted to push it farther towards the back fence. And council agreed with that, except that that really impacts the adjoining property, which shares a back fence. There's no lane buffer between them. So there's issues like that I think we have to deal with. And the vehicle access, I get the point if you just allow someone to build another building in the backyard and put people in it. Then of course the question is, where do they all park? Are they back in the street? And are we engineered for that? Is our community engineered for that kind of an impact? To our street system, for example, and all the other things that go along with added density. So that's a significant discussion for me.
Jason?
Yeah, so on this one too, I'm wondering if there's, any precedent for requiring specific forms of landscaping and other things that can help soften the impact of, these suites, and then even thinking about placement of, openings, glazing, where and what form, and, because there's a different impact from a giant living room window versus like a little bathroom window that, is just, more utilitarian. So, and then decks and all that whole fun stuff. But I also think that this discussion highlights our need for, in some of our greenfield or newer development areas, is really encouraging laneways, and having this more of an option in some of our newer neighborhoods where it is engineered properly, because it can have some advantages. And
I'm going to move on in the
Yeah,
discussion.
well, just to that point, that's a really good point. And as we were talking about the university and missing middle, I think somebody mentioned the fact that when the new subdivisions are going in, we should design in the missing middle. And so that's another example of it.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, just following up on that one point, some of the elements like landscaping and glazing speak to development permit style considerations, and we don't have development permits for residential properties, but there is, or for single family residential, but there actually is a provision, and staff would need to spend more time looking into it, but there's legislation that allows you to apply DPs to certain types of development. And single family development is not one, but I think intensive residential is one of them. And we did add it in. I don't know if this qualifies, it would need some investigation.
Yes, I think we would have to look at the impact of more bureaucracy over top of that. But I'm thinking that there's probably a way how you can almost kind of density bonus it, so there's a setback here and there's a setback here if you can do A, B, and C, sort of thing.
Okay, next.
Open space requirements. There are a couple holes in our open space requirement regulatory structure. One is that are worth considering. And so, staff haven't kind of determined what these would be or whether they would be something that council or would be appropriate in the end. But we don't have any open space requirements for larger commercial developments, and that might be appropriate for areas outside of the downtown area for employees of those areas. And another hole right now is that there are open space requirements for zones, multifamily residential zones and CD zones, but it probably would be more appropriate to apply those open space requirements to uses. So those would be multifamily uses, so that, for example, in commercial zones that include a residential component that we have some open space requirements. So this is not probably a very complicated change to make and suitable for implementation in the short term.
Okay.
So
I
yeah,
should see quickly.
but please don't. Yes, we're really supportive of seeing some better open space requirements in our multi-family developments. I don't think we're actually building communities that work in a lot of cases. When you consider all the ages that move in there. But the other thing that I'm curious about, and I don't know where it fits, is that since we are getting some higher buildings being proposed, is how we contemplate open space that is family friendly in towers. So if you go into condo buildings, there's usually a social room, but some buildings I know in Toronto are looking at playrooms, communal playrooms, so that you build community within a tower situation. Or else there's really great green space in proximity. So I don't want us to forget that some families will be living in apartments and condos, and how we take care of that as well.
Yeah, to speak to that, in researching what other communities do for open space and looking at how our numbers compare to other communities, one of the things that I did note was that indoor amenity spaces are another layer that are added into some communities that we haven't contemplated, and so an indoor amenity space is certainly something that we could look at adding to apartment complexes, for example.
And just one more thing that I heard, which I hope we would not do in our community, is that there was a building proposed somewhere in the Lower Mainland where there was mixed forms of housing. So there was subsidized housing, but then there was market rental housing. And they were actually dividing their amenity space so that depending on which resident you were, you had access to different outdoor space. And I think that is actually important.
It's horrendous.
So I hope that we would never go there.
And could we not apply that to our mud zones as well? Sort of include more open space there?
Yeah, the mud zones actually have built into them open space requirements, but I think the kind of proposal that I've mentioned here is would then, if a new mud zone was built without open space requirements, because it would have a multifamily use, it would then apply. No multifamily use would then escape the need for open space.
Nice to apply some of that to areas like in the business park too, which is turning out to be just this huge swath of concrete.
That is the first point. Requirements for commercial space, for open space in commercial areas, because of the desire to have something for employees, lunch breaks, that kind of stuff.
Okay, that covers all your topics?
Oh, there's
Yeah.
one
go on.
last one. Yeah, one last one is active transportation, a fairly straightforward, simple one. It would be to require some sort of shower change facility in employment zones for employees to encourage active transportation, cycle commuting to work. Something reasonable.
Then covered bike storage, or
Covered bike storage.
either covered or indoor. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on secure bike storage.
Yeah. And there was one last one, a topic that came up fairly
Yes.
recently, the rental zoning. So there is new legislation that has it been adopted by the province or is under consideration?
It's on the-
It's in the ledge right now.
It's in okay, so this zoning is intended to enable the zoning of residential lands to mandate purpose-built multifamily residential or rental, to put tenure into the regulatory structure that local government can address. And so then if this legislation is adopted, council would be able to say this area has to be rental as opposed to just single family or multifamily. But at this point, we don't know exactly how this is going to roll out, and so it's going to be hard for us to address in this update until we know more about the impacts and how that regulatory structure will be set up.
I think we want to be ready to pull the trigger as soon as the legislation is actually ratified. We also, I think, want to speak to current purpose-built rental. We don't have many, maybe 3 or 4 buildings that we actually put a moratorium on. They will not be torn down and rebuilt as stratified or freehold. That it will be purpose-built rental in perpetuity. Looking for a motion from council to make sure. We have a motion from council dating back, I think, my first time about mobile home parks not being rezoned. I think we should take a similar approach to the rental, current purpose-built rental properties out there. And there's the one in the Highlands, there's the one on Berkeley, there's maybe one in Dental, two in Dental. There's not very many out there.
We do have a policy right now about stratification of
Yeah, we don't
previously
stratify either,
occupied
yeah.
buildings. So, and those purpose-built rentals, I think, would, at least some
But
of
they
them
could tear
would
them
be.
down, make a rezoning application, and we're saying no. At least I'd like to see council say no. And that they become ultimately rental zones.
Certainly, I thought as a first move, we would just rezone the land that the buildings are on to this designation where purpose-built is. That would be, like, I think we should be ready to go with that legislation.
Yeah, and that's my worry is that,
And then we can move from there, which would be a longer term sort of effort. But I think with what's in front of the legislature right now, we could be prepared to say these are rental zoning and they will be forever. Just to buy some time to do neighborhood planning.
well, so you don't want to lose any of that.
Yeah.
We have how many units in deficiency already? I think it was,
Yeah, that, you have to be careful with that because I don't disagree with the intent. I mean, right now, for example, we are zoning developments because some portion of them is purpose-built rental. It's one of the things that urges us to exercise our discretion to rezone the property. And so those ones you wouldn't want to see that somebody try and pull an end run around that process and later come along and change the designation. Some of these historic ones or some of the ones that are existing now were not necessarily zoned for rental. And I'm just trying to think of some of the ones that the mayor was mentioning, and I don't know the history of them. So I don't know that if that was part of their zoning regulation, or whether the building owner has just chosen to use it as rental as opposed to just selling them off. And if they are, in fact, stratified today. So, because the difference to me is whether or not they're stratified. And if they're stratified, then you're taking something away.
no, the ones I'm talking about aren't stratified, they're owned by one owner for the whole building, they're not
Oh.
stratified.
You have to be careful because they might be stratified and still owned by one owner.
I'm pretty sure they're not.
So I think we'd have to be careful with that because in some cases, yeah, you're preserving what you want to preserve, but in other cases, you're actually taking away a significant value and rights of a landowner. So I think we want to be just a little bit careful about that. I mean, my history is even if you intended to rent it, the banks would insist you stratify it just for the financing, because if they had to seize it, they want to be able to sell these things off individually. And so I'd be surprised if they were in fact not stratified, possible, but it would sort of run counter to what the usual practice was.
Another way of checking it would be if there's a housing agreement on the property that I think it was built for rental. And whereas there's other projects that we know in the community that were recently built that are just being rented because the property owner chose, I think we wouldn't target those. But as a first step, make sure that those that are under a housing agreement stay as rental projects.
But I certainly agree going forward, we want to be ready for this, absolutely.
And some of the older rentals, you know, like Wilson Crescent there, I don't know, there's 2 or 3 buildings down there.
They're not stratified.
They're not certain.
Those are the ones I'm talking about.
But
the
they've
back
come
main
to,
building,
they've come to
which
the
is
end of
stratified.
life. They're almost at end of life. You know, there's rumors floating around that it's up for sale. So there we got 200 rental units up for sale for demolition. So even these ones that we're building now, if we call them rentals forever, 40 years from now, they might be looking pretty sad.
And they'll be replaced with rentals.
Yeah, well, that's fine. And, on the strata, I think that would probably be right. People would buy blocks of rentals, so these 8 or 9, would buy the end of these, so they would probably be stratified off. But I don't, you know, if the bank says you've got to sell them, you have to sell rentals. Selling units to individuals.
The point of this is to preserve
Yes, I know.
what the rent we have out there now. That's purpose-built rental, not, for example, the Mirage or whatever it's called. Can't even keep track. That
Morocco.
those Morocco. No, that's that's all stratified. It's all individual.
Yeah,
PIDs. And whereas the Aquilini one up at Tantalus and Garibaldi Way, there's a couple on Wilson Crescent, they're not stratified, as far as I understand. They're built as rental, and my goal is that we rezone them as rental and make sure they're rental in perpetuity.
So from this discussion, should I assume that the council wishes staff to be aware and cognizant of what's going on with this regulatory structure and to be prepared to move on it when it is possible?
Absolutely.
All right,
That's it?
there's the summary.
Okay.
And just at the end, along with this, we're also initiating work. We would like to initiate work on some of these more complex amendments
It'll
that
take.
will take more time. So that's going to happen at the same time.
And so just back to the university zoning one, is there some sort of direction that council should give here to make sure we're sort of hitting a place mark of some sort?
Yeah, I would ask if council is supportive of staff's recommendation that we begin to move forward with the amendments and investigation and drafting of those amendments, reaching out and continuing discussions with the stakeholders on those amendments, and to bring back a suite of changes that are proposed by staff to try and achieve the separated plan.
Is that a motion?
Well,
It's a really long
I would
motion.
like to
Sorry.
make sure but that's pausing things, in other words, right? Today, it'll be pause. I think that was, yeah.
Well,
No,
I don't know that we need to pause. The existing development that is proposed and is occurring is, within the scope of the Sabria plan. There is actually the large block to the north. We have, the landowner has come in and started talking to the district about, development opportunities on that property. But there's a dialogue going on about what staff is interested in achieving and what they're interested in achieving, and I think some of that is really constructive that we're able to work towards this kind of shared outcome. So I don't think that we need to necessarily put it on a pause, but I think it's worth staff getting going on getting the zoning in place and some of these changes to reflect that application, or the separate plan.
Well, I agree with the intent of the motion, except it was a little bit long-winded. So what I'm suggesting
Like
is,
nice, simple.
Getting beat up.
is staff draft something. This meeting isn't over
No.
right now, and
Bring it back
before we
later.
terminate this meeting, bring it back to us this afternoon, if that's possible.
Okay. I actually, in terms of, I don't know that staff need a motion at this point. What I am looking for is understanding from council if all of the items that we've identified there that we believe are potential items to address in a short-term zoning bylaw update are supported.
My read on the discussion is yes.
Okay.
I think what council's looking for is some sort of trigger that from this day forward, new parameters around the university of what would be considered for new applications.
Okay.
And so we're looking for some sort of direction, clear direction and a motion that starts to, make sure that that's happening.
Okay, so I think we need to,
So that's what we're saying is, we're gonna recess now, because it's Karen's birthday.
okay.
And before the end of the committee of the whole meeting, just come back with a recommended motion on how we,
So you want us to eat the cake as well?
I want you
No,
to
I'm just
take.
joking.
Okay, we'll take
Make the
a motion.
motion.
Oh.
Karen, I'm not exercising.
Matt, there's a couple on waste management that were in the table.
In the old table?
The table at the back of your report.
Yeah.
And it was about adding regulations for multi-family solid waste collection areas.
Oh, sorry, I missed those.
It said 6 to 12 months, like I know they're longer term, but why is that so long term? Like
Right.
that seems simple in my mind, but obviously there's some complexity.
My apologies for missing that one. That is, so we have in our development permit areas a reference to a technical document that says how big those sizes should be. But actually getting those sizes right, the document that City of Vancouver produced, for example, is massive, super complicated, and it's really specific information about how many units, what size. That is actually going to be fairly hard to figure out what's right. When we look at those numbers, that system of determining the sizes, that is getting that number right is actually going to be pretty hard because it's going to take a fair bit of research and checking in with existing governments using those to see if they're working. We've already gone down that road a bit and it's not been straightforward.
Okay, and before we break, any questions from the massive gallery? Okay, we're going to take a recess for 10 minutes. We are back in our committee of the whole meeting and we're on item 3.2, the Cheekeye fan update. Welcome everyone. Welcome Cheekeye. Over to you, Jonas.
Thank you, Mayor. My name is Velaniskis, Director of Community Planning. With me today is David Rolston, the municipal engineer, and representatives of the Cheekeye development. We're bringing an update forward on the rezoning and OSP amendment applications on the Cheekeye fan for the Cheekeye River development. So the last time we were in front of council was in March with an update, and this is another update. The purpose of today's meeting is to bring forward a little bit more information on the potential co-sharing of funding for operation and maintenance of the debris barrier system. A little bit more information on the potential storage sites when there is cleanup that's required. And then an update on the steps that will be needed for these bylaws to get going again, because we do have the official community planning that is scheduled for adoption potentially in June. So coming out of the March Community Development Committee meeting, there was a request for more information on the cost sharing and the examination of storage sites and identification of public hearing dates. So just want to keep that in mind, keep tracking it. In terms of all the information that we're providing, it is, I just want to preface it with the fact that it's very high level, very conceptual information, and as we get down the detailed design stage, those numbers are really likely to change and get more firm. So I would encourage you not to pay too much attention to the numbers and more to the mechanisms that they're based on. So looking at the annual cost for both operation and maintenance and building the reserve for dealing with large events, it looks like the cost, conceptually, it looks just under $1 million annually. So the reserve building is basically half of it, or just a little over half, and the rest is insurance, the maintenance cost, and then the annual cleanup cost. And the annual cleanup cost would be the largest piece of that annual maintenance. We also need to keep in mind that if this development does not proceed, the district will need to deal with the mitigation, whether it's by creating or installing a mitigation device or retreating from the fan. And we know that there's an unacceptable level of risk, so it's either we're going to do it through development or the district will have to do it on its own. There is a good likelihood that the proposed barrier, if it is built, it would reduce the level of hazard not just to this new development but also to the existing development that's on the fan, which includes infrastructure, residential and institutional development. And so given that broader benefit, we feel that the operations and management cost, not the installation cost, but the operation and management cost, we should really look at cost sharing as an option and evaluate it. So we did run some numbers, and our finance department has helped us greatly with it. And we looked at a very basic split, 50-50, which aligns quite well with the notion of operation and maintenance separating from building the reserve, which is also around 50-50. So in the local service area, the annual cost, and this is assessment based, would be about $378 per assessment or per home. So that would include the LAS, the local area service cost, as well as the general taxation cost, because those homes will be paying both. In terms of general taxation, we're looking at, for residential properties, about $38 per home, and so that's kind of an average between, a single family home would pay a little more because the assessments are higher versus a strata unit. Light industry, 102, business and other category, about 126, and so on. And that represents about 1.8 tax increase if we were looking at today's dollars across the various classes. Now, this component could be phased in over time. It wouldn't have to happen in a single year. And then impact on a home in the local area would be 417. Sorry, so my previous statement actually 378 was just the LES portion, and then if we include the general tax, it would be $417. So I think the more we're looking at it, including our finance department, the more there's a realization that while the operation and management or maintenance proportion could be funded through the local area service, the reserve building is a really good candidate for being a district reserve and a district expense, meaning it's general taxation. One is that if the district could look at more general reserve than just something that is specific to the barrier. If it's funded through the local area service, that reserve is all it's ever going to be used for in the future. So it's a bit of a difficult entity to deal with from a financial perspective. And Christine can touch on this a little more, but in our financial plan, we do have a policy around having a general reserve for dealing with emergency situations, and so this could be purpose for that. There could be policy around building that reserve up to a certain threshold before it becomes a general. I don't know, Christine, if you want to add to it.
Sure, happy to. I think you're doing a great job, actually.
Okay, great.
To be honest. But essentially, when I came in through our department, we started looking at building a $15 million reserve, which essentially is not to replace infrastructure. It is in the big 20-year or whatever, 50-year massive event would be to clear and remove. Obviously, nobody can predict if that's ever going to actually happen or when it will happen. So the reserve is a bit of an unusual animal to build such a large base. And because of our local area service is so restrictive, we've collected it for a very specified purpose. The reserve can only ever be sourced for that. So our observation is that it would probably make more sense to do that more as a general, broader population taxation and make it this general emergency mitigation fund that our long-term financial policies talk to. And then we can repurpose it for whatever major event, whether we have a dike breach or something else. It could be repurposed for any major event. So it gives us a little more latitude or opportunity to leverage that reserve in the future and leaves more flexibility for future councils to deal with. Now, you can still put really restrictive policies around that reserve or the bylaw for that reserve. So I know you're all looking a little bit worried. It doesn't mean that it can be open-ended and at the leisure, although any reserve always is, as you know. The bylaws are at council's discretion. So, but that was just the recommendation from our side, is then they're really only dealing with an O&M, which is a true cost. We know the cost is there and you're apportioning that. And I would probably even argue that even that should maybe want to consider what split that should be, given that mitigation technique is possibly for a broader population than just that development.
I do want to get through the presentation, so is it just to clarify what was said?
Well, it's on the reserve. If you had $15 million in reserve, who's always telling us to build up the reserves, could you take the interest from that $15 million and use it for something else?
So technically, under the legislation, the interest is apportioned to the capital reserve it's purposed to, so we'd have to get probably permission to do that.
But when you hit the limit of the reserve that you require, and then every year there's $400,000 interest.
We could certainly look to seeing that, but remember too that $15 million is your today's cost requirement, so you probably want some of that interest to help keep up with the inflationary component of what that cost might be when the breach actually occurs, right? Like the value of money changes over time. So it's, that's probably one of the key reasons the legislation does require you to accrue interest into those reserves is to try and mitigate against those future inflationary increases on costs.
So
those
I think
reserves
that
are intended to cover.
your numbers there, so it's not a $15 million reserve, it's 15 million this year, it's 16 million next year, it's 17 million the year after.
It could be, yes. I mean, we sort of did some costing back based on the time frame to come up with the magic $480,000 that you need to build each year to get there, but we did assume inflation was part of that growth component. But we also assumed that there would be inflation as well.
So two questions. So in the cost sharing, in the first slide where it was, take the 50-50 example, and $450,000 was towards the reserve. So what you're suggesting then is instead of half of that coming from this particular development and the other half from general taxation, you're suggesting the whole of that 458 comes from general taxation, which reduces the impact of the development and raises the impact of the balance of the community. I mean, am I clear in that? Is that what you're suggesting?
That would be my recommendation to this council from a strategic perspective, is that you not earmark a reserve building under the local area service, yes. Just because, again, to put such restrictions on how that future reserve is managed and used.
And then just to follow up on the purpose of the reserve then, again, when you're suggesting that the 15 million is the appropriate number, that we build it to 15 million, and then we say, now that we've got 15 million, the next monies that come in could be used for other things, or if we had a flood when we've got 5 million in the reserve, that we could access that 5 million to deal with a flood issue, something unrelated to this development.
I would suggest that council would like to consider that strategic approach. I think there's a lot of unknowns right now around this whole complexion. So Mr. Buxton and I were just trying to come up with what would be a reasonable approach to carry on with the review of this development. Realistically, should our emergency reserve be larger or smaller? I think that's a broader question that frankly I haven't got my head around yet. But what we are saying is by putting it over in that bin of money, it allows more flexibility to determine all hazards reserve. And it gives you and future councils more flexibility to deal with those funds.
In 50 years from now.
Exactly.
No.
And who knows, maybe there's insurances or other mitigation techniques by then, and we're happy to stay insured, or by then we're a self-insuring municipality, who knows, right? So it just leaves more flexibility for council.
But
if money is collected very specifically from a neighborhood, it has to go back to that neighborhood. That's the downside of a local area service. Not to mention the administrative pieces that come with it. Also the O&M, we've made another recommendation in here that we not consider parcel taxes, that we look at using an assessment-based structure even in the local area service. It's much more, allows us a much more flexibility to move with the actual cost of O&M. Parcel taxes create a considerable amount of financial burden administratively. There's a lot more required that frankly we're even at our own taxes now to realign and make sure that we're more compliant.
Well, I'm going to ask Jonas to continue.
Okay.
We'll get sidetracked.
Okay. So for the purposes of continuing with the evaluation of this application, we would recommend that we maintain this as a funding option, as a potential funding option for the reserve building specifically. And I think as we go down to detailed design, again, there's going to be additional clarity in terms of what the actual impact would be on taxation and on the local area service. And then at this point, we're not making any final decisions on this. We're just putting it on the table as an option. Again, I think it's very difficult to make a final decision on something that we don't really know what the implications are going to be financially. at this point, and we need that detailed design, so we kind of need to go further in the application process, go to third reading and allow those numbers to roll in. In terms of storage of debris, so from the clean out that would be required, one of the factors that impacts the cost of operation and maintenance is how close can you find sites to clean up the debris. And the applicants have identified one crown parcel. It's be currently in the SLRD. It's 24 hectares in size. It would potentially hold 32 years or more worth of debris if we take 14,000 cubic meters per year. That's what's projected. But there's probably other sites, and again, this is just showing council that there are sites that could be explored on the Cheekeye fan. A lot of work would have to be done to actually get tenure for those sites, and that would be incorporated as part of the overall exercise that we do after the detailed design is completed.
So two questions. So I was trying to figure out where this is, and actually this is a little clearer in the picture. So now I can see the 4 lakes. So that's up in the hydro line, is that strip that comes down. That's the area that was logged, I think, just a few years ago. I'm surprised that's not in the district, but it's in the regional district. It's outside of our boundary.
I believe so.
The storage area?
Yeah, I'm not sure. In any event, I know the area. So, but the question I had, so I wonder, first of all, whether it's in the regional district or our boundaries. I don't know, but as I say, I'd be surprised because the alternate water source was kind of just around from that. And I always thought that was within our boundaries, but maybe not. So, in any event, the other thing is that debris gets put there for, I think it's a 40-year capacity, something like that. So then what happens? So when the debris gets dumped there, we've all heard about the problem with this debris, whether it be wood and stone and all the other things. Is it somehow processed on site and then moved away, or does it just pile up? And then where do you go after 40 years? I mean, I know it's a long way away, but...
Yeah, I think as part of the detailed design process, and what would follow after that is maybe not looking just at one site, but at multiple sites, and whether there would be options for processing. Those answers we don't yet have answers to, or those questions.
I think this is sort of almost a worst case scenario location. If we have a large amount of material to move in one event, this is a viable location. I think on an annual basis, there are some options, because the materials are far less, to actually process and use without having to take to this site on an annual basis, because the material, the volumes are substantially lower on an annual basis. But if we get one big event, this is somewhere that a lot of the material, if not all the material, can go. So I don't think there's, I don't think there's an intent to use this as an annual dump. This is the place where it goes when we have a lot of material and no real place to put potentially many tens of thousands of cubes of material.
It does appear to be outside of the district boundary. This is the district boundary, and here's the site.
So on an annual basis, I think we'll be able to use it and get rid of it, find locations for those much smaller amounts on an annual basis.
But the further it goes, the higher our operating and maintenance costs. So the report reads like it would go into that lot, whether it's a small amount or a large amount, because it's explosives. So I'm just curious.
It could, or it's much easier to process a few thousand cubes of material. If you've got 20, 30, 40, 50,000 cubes, it's just simply finding, someone downtown needs their lot filled, they need 6,000 cubes. We've got 266,000 cubes. There's just nowhere to take that. But if it's 26,000 on an annual basis, or whatever the number is, you can likely deal with that and find homes for it. For fill in the Valley Bottom. People always need fill. We're going to need fill for some of our dike maintenance
So
works.
So people that need fill are gonna pay to come and get, we won't incur
We
those
could-
extra costs.
There is an opportunity to process and sell it in small volumes. When you get to the hundreds of thousands, you're not going to process that, you just need to get rid of it.
Well, I didn't see anything in the report describing the type of gravel coming out of there. I was under the impression it wasn't a structural fill that you get out of there.
So, through the chair, my understanding is on an annual basis, it's probably material that you can probably work with. If you get the debris flow, then it's mixed with all sorts of varying grades of material. There's organics, there's stumps, there's trees.
Does work with mean dig out and sell, or does it mean dig out, wash, crush, and sell?
There's probably some processing. I mean, in my experience in Canmore, there is some processing involved, but it's in volumes that's manageable. I mean,
What kind of product may or may not?
I mean, anything from large or ornamental boulders that people may want to use, or you put aside and stockpile for riprap protection or otherwise, all the way down to pebble size would come down. If you have debris flows, proper debris flows, there would be a lot of mud involved. And that mud is not something that's favorable for foundation conditions. And you probably want to get rid of the mud.
As, you know, as long as we have the good numbers on it. On the gravel, when you say decorative boulders.
Yeah, I mean,
there's lots of decorative boulders around. I mean, you go out to Bob's gravel pit and he's got decorative boulders all around the inside edge. But I mean, I just, as long as we have the numbers, like, yes, we're going to get this much gravel, it's going to take this much processing to make it sellable for this much. That's all I'm here to see. If there's a break even, bonus.
keeping in mind though that the annual sediment load is supposed to pass the barrier, right?
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
not trying to stop everything. It's not a hydro dam.
You're the engineers and it's just numbers.
Corporal Rolston.
Thank you. Nice.
Nice hair.
I just wanted to say, from my perspective, I think this is it's highlighting that there is a site that's close by, by the debris site. It's 475,000 cubic meters, which is, I believe, slightly less than a 100-year event. So, you know, if there was a more extreme event than that, we'd be looking for additional land. I think we're going to be looking for more certainty on this as part of the detailed design and looking at, you know, how do we handle a really large debris flow? What are we doing on an annual basis? So all these questions that are being asked, I think we're going to be looking for those details prior to final adoption as part of the kind of detailed design process.
Yeah, we don't need to get into that nitty gritty now, just to know that we have a piece. John, did you want to add something here?
I was going to say the river can also take some of the material. So naturally it's carrying the sediment down, and Matthias can speak much more knowledgeably to this than I can. So if there's 14,000 cubic meters behind it, we can take some around, move it to the riverside, and it should be carried down versus trying to store it. So if we're not, it's the mud and junk that we're trying to get rid of, that might be the right spot for it to go. So now you're replacing 4,000 cubic meters of material versus 14, or wherever those numbers lie.
And those details will get more understood and solid as the detailed design gets further down the road. Okay.
And again, just highlight that we're operating on limited information in the absence of the detailed design. However, all the information that we're gathering now and that we're getting from the proponent is going to be useful, even if the proponent, you know, if the rezoning and OCP is adopted and the proponent decides not to pursue the project, this will be useful information for the district to have. And finally, touching on the bylaw reading, so the new OCP is scheduled for consideration of adoption in June. If that happens, I think it's pointless to try and schedule a public hearing now. We will need to redo the first and second reading on the official community plan amendment. And so we're proposing that we target June 12th as the date for the first and second reading, and then scheduling a public hearing on June 26th.
For this?
For Yes, for the OCP amendment.
Councillor Karen?
I was a bit confused by this in the report. So this development has always been under the old OCP. I'm not sure a lot has changed to the new OCP, but we want it to be approved under the new OCP.
Yes, it's a totally bureaucratic administrative issue in that the bylaw that this amendment is trying to amend is going to be no longer in existence when the new OCP is out.
So when I was reading this, the question I had, I mean, I can understand wanting to get this going somewhere. And it's just kind of been in suspension for, I don't know, the last year. And so I think we have to deal with it in some fashion. But there's, it was mentioned a couple of times in the presentation, there's information to come, detailed design, etc. So if we go through and have a public hearing on June 26th, and then we start getting all this other information, what is the threshold to come back and have to have another public hearing? Because I know from past discussions, the proponent is anxious to get the third reading, hopefully pass third reading so they have some certainty and they can then go ahead and start doing some of the work that will generate this information. But at some point, there's information that comes that's new, and if I understand the process correctly, it will then require another public hearing, which means we have to rescind third reading, go back and look at it again. And so, and I'm not sure if that gives the proponent any comfort or not when they think of third reading being rescinded. So I'm just kind of wondering on the process, how we deal with that.
That's a good point.
I'm not sure if it, Robin, do you think you're,
If I might, I think it's all based on risk and risk of challenge. So, and how substantial the new information is and what is changing and what the public has a right to be able to comment on. So until we have actual specifics about what would trigger a new, the issue that would trigger a new public hearing, we can't really answer. But in short, it's probably 95% of anything new would trigger a new public hearing.
so can I ask a hypothetical question?
Sure.
If, for example, we went out to the public with the information we have here, it said X quantity and X cost and maintenance cost would be this. If the true numbers came back less than that, would we have to go to the public hearing? If they came out much, much more, I suspect that's information the public has a right to comment
If
on.
it came out of the risk was a lot less and there's likely a lesser cost maybe to the public,
But it
I
added
would roll the
density
dice
and- yeah.
and think that you would not need to go back to public hearing.
Unless it added density. Unless all of a
Unless it
sudden
added
said, oh,
density, but yeah, of course,
would go back.
of course.
But if it was dramatically more, it might force another.
It would, because the public has agreed to talk to that.
Did you have a follow-up?
Well, no, that was kind of my point. I mean, I just think of some of the outstanding issues. So for example, there's this potential split of operating maintenance costs and staff's comment about dealing with the reserve versus just having a designated reserve and the impact to local taxation. So that's kind of a numbers thing really. And maybe we can deal with that for the development. If they're not going to be paying extra share towards the reserve, but just as part of the general tax base, and maybe they pay a higher portion of other operating maintenance costs, so that the effect is more or less the same. It could be. So you could balance out the numbers and play with those. So to the individual taxpayer, it wouldn't really be much different, for example, than what you had on the screen. The significant issue that I think is how you deal with this major issue. And we've talked about that before, and whether somebody should backstop it, whether it should be insured, and we don't have information about that. And while I'd like to see this somehow move down the road, I'm not sure. That to me is a significant issue. And I take staff's comment on that, but you know, if the district is significantly exposed, we have to evaluate that risk and say, is it 1 in a million risk or in 100 risk, et cetera, some kind of a big financial hit. And is that new information when that kind of develops? If we don't have, to me, that kind of critical piece that's so far is eluded us, I think.
And is it worth, whatever it comes to council to the public hearing, being overly conservative in those numbers would lessen the risk of having to go back to a second public hearing.
I would think so, absolutely.
And these numbers are fairly conservative.
Okay. Okay. Ted?
Yeah. You know, you think of all the years, all the water under the bridge, I'd be very surprised if we didn't have to go back for another reading. But if we don't move forward now and start pushing for all the real numbers, how are we gonna get it forward? You know, I mean, something's gonna come along. I can't see there not being a change substantial enough to go back for another vote. So what? So we'll go back for another vote.
Well, and that's the risk, and it's how it's articulated, whether where that threshold may or may not be to have to go back to another public hearing, and that's something the developers should consider as they work with staff on finalizing the report for the public hearing.
Am I wrong on that? I see some frowns.
I think what we as staff need to do is, whatever the conditions of the third reading are, they need to provide council the comfort that council wants, that we're not exposing the district to risk of them when we get to making that decision.
Yeah.
Those conditions get us to where we need to be. And that then the applicant's going to have to decide if that provides enough certainty to him to proceed on that basis. We have some work to do to get those conditions, to get you comfortable.
So this discussion has been around the part that the development can play and that we can play in terms of general taxation of reserve. But maybe someone can speak to where we're at with the province and where we're at with insurance, because those are the other two pieces of this puzzle.
And someone want to speak to insurance, and then we'll...
Sure. Maybe John, you want to speak
Sure.
to insurance? You've done the research on it.
Yeah, so we've been working with 3 different groups, Munich RE, Swiss RE, and Zurich RE, all of whom have got specialists on their staff who have been going through the information on debris flow. They've been in touch with Matthias and BGC to understand sort of the historical events and what causes debris flows, so on and so forth. They will be monitoring sort of the process as this iterative design of the debris structure is put together to understand what risks they're going to be exposed to as they build a policy on debris removal. So right now they've put forward considerable amounts of time and money understanding this, and sort of are taking 2 different approaches on how do we provide an insurance program for the district or what the policyholder will be. So it's something that is being developed and will be developed as we continue the designs, but not something that I can say it's going to cost you X amount right now. So we've used a placeholder of $100,000 annually, and we think that's a good number to carry right now for the operations.
And should that change dramatically, we'd like to have to go back to public hearing. That's an example of the public has a right to understand the financial implications on the properties as a result of this.
Yeah, I think there's an expectation that there will be some fluctuation within the ballpark, right? And if the ballpark starts to change dramatically, I think that would send it back.
On the EMBC issue, we asked at the staff level for EMBC to commit to filling the gap between where our reserve may be and the recovery costs. What we got back was a letter that they offer 80% coverage for recovery costs, which is kind of great. That's what your program is. That doesn't actually answer the question we asked. So we've actually scheduled a meeting with the minister that maybe tomorrow and maybe on the 30th. We're just trying to figure that out. But we will then pose that question directly to the minister, hopefully get a more direct answer. And the question is, will you commit to filling that gap between our expenses and our reserve, should that ever happen?
And ultimately, if the province comes back and says yes, that becomes part of the public information package. If they say no, that's part of the debate, and that's something the public and council will deliberate in the public hearing process.
Yeah, so what's up there, that's first and second reading of the OCP portion alone, because the zoning already has second reading and we've been through one public hearing. So I'm just curious, and for example, let's just take the cost sharing and maintenance. I think it was on the first slides. Is it staff's intent to bring us something a little bit more specific as a recommendation prior to the public hearing? Public hearing, I assume, would be for the whole thing, zoning and OCP. So prior to that, would we have something as a council that we've been able to chew over and say, yeah, let's take that to public hearing? Or are we just going to say there's going to be some sharing? Are we going to get more specific about that? And I take staff's point about the reserves and designating, and I'm kind of back and forth in that right now. I mean, I think at some point we want to have a minimum. We hold on to them. Beyond that, if we start accumulating monies, be able to use them for other purposes. So I get the general taxation concept. The other thing, we can maybe balance it out a little bit with the local area service charges so that it kind of levels out a little bit. I don't know if 50-50 is right. I mean, it has an appeal to me, but there's not much science in that statement, frankly. It's just kind of, well, okay, that sounds fair. But, and I'm not sure, I got from the report that staff maybe would try and put a little bit more of a fine grain on that. And so I'm not sure what might come forward or a justification. Is it 50-50, is it 70-30, is it whatever, 20-80? Is there some kind of science to that? So I'm just wondering how much of this, rather than try to decide it today, I'm sort of wondering how much of this you might have for us or for the public prior to June 26th.
I think we can add a little bit more detail in terms of the 50-50 because, well, the recommendation that we have is that we look at the debris barrier reserve, which is not too far from the 50-50 option. So we could look at that split, you know, what's the barrier reserve versus the operation and maintenance. But in terms of more fine-grained information to the cost, I don't think we'll have that by the public hearing, and we can't really get any more detail out of it until we have the detailed design.
I'm sorry, if I wasn't thinking about the actual numbers. It was kind of the formula.
Yes.
I was more concerned about.
Through the chair, I would like to tweak it just a little bit. This report had originally come with a 50-50 split, and then we've made the recommendation back that we look at that, but we felt that it was probably close enough to 50-50 that we could work around that. But certainly we could come back with a little better sense, because right now the reserve is higher than the O&M based on what we know today. The only other thing that I think is still problematic for me to get my head around in terms of really understanding the transition is during build out and what we're going to do to recover the local area service when we don't have 1,215 parcels, because right now we're assuming it's already built out when we throw those numbers at you, and we're throwing those numbers based out on assessment values today. So obviously these estimates are very difficult. We're really having to go across our current 2018 average strata units and make a lot of assumptions. And they're not necessarily bad. I mean, that's as good as we have today. But I haven't got an answer back yet as to how we're dealing with it, whether it's through an LDA or some kind of agreement with the developer to make up those costs in the interim. I haven't got back a lot of information on that yet.
In terms of the second part of your question, which was for the public hearing, I think our recommendation would be to introduce it as an option, so that if it's stated to the public that this could be the way it gets funded, or it could be less, then I don't think we would have to go back to public hearing if that, if it was less. But I think if we said, it's going to be, the barrier is going to be funded through general taxation, the reserve is going to be funded through general taxation, and it looks like it's going to be about this much, and that's a real option that the district will evaluate when the detailed design comes in. I don't think that this would send it back to public hearing if it, we went through detailed design and the number came out, and when the district decided that yes, we will fund it, or that it was smaller. If that amount was bigger, then I think it would send it back.
So, just on Ms. Maddie's point, when I looked at this, I thought, you know, as far as what happens during build-up, who covers the costs and so forth, that we just follow the polygon formula. As units come on the tax roll, the developer's contribution, this is the 50% or whatever portion is assignable to the development. And I know that particular proposal didn't go ahead, but I'm not sure that that was a contentious issue. So that was my first thought on that, is to propose something along those lines. So as units come on, developer's contribution comes on, but on day one, the developer's making up whatever the development's share of the pot is. The other thing is that up until now, I mean, the reason I think it's so important to have not really certainty around the numbers, but some examples, and maybe they're very conservative estimates, is so far we've told the public, to my recollection, that this is entirely funded by the development. It's a relatively new concept to say to the public, by the way, the rest of the community gets protected, or a significant part of it, so the rest of the community is going to start contributing to the maintenance. So I think we have to be ready to give them a little bit of certainty, because you know, not just you might have to pay one day. I get the fact that the numbers aren't firm, but I think the formula and the justification for the formula is the important part, and we have to sell it, frankly.
Yes.
And I know it was council's suggestion.
Yep.
I think, you know, for the record, it was council's suggestion that we do this just as a matter of more or less fairness.
And through the mayor, that's one of the reasons I think we're here, is that we do need to get a sense of council's comfort level with some of these options for us to be able to put those costs for public hearing. That's one of the reasons we wanted to have a more wholesome discussion today, is to understand if that's palatable or not at all. Certainly you can't still build a reserve 100% LAS. I think it's going to be pretty crippling to the properties in there, and ultimately future council still has to think about those homeowners at a future time. It's a fairly big bill if it's truly these costs. And I think there are options where we could have an all hazards reserve and still have a bit of local area service going to an all hazards, on the understanding that it is a reserve for a more wholesome purpose as well. So I think there are some options in there. So it really comes down to getting council's comfort level with what you'd like us to assume for public hearing in that costing.
I have a quick question about the difference between the gravel removal piece and operation and maintenance. What would be a yearly, like what would happen on a daily basis in terms of O&M versus periodic gravel removal, which is 188,000?
First of all, there's a road up there that would need to be maintained. And then there need to be inspections. There will you can't let a forest grow on it, for example, so we'll have to essentially mow the lawn, if you will. It's a very large structure, so there's a lot of very steep lawn to mow. There will be potentially some ironworks or concrete works in areas that will need to be inspected as well, not necessarily annually, only inspected annually.
And these are likely costs that will go up over time. They won't necessarily be that amount at the beginning, but I'm just wondering was that the amount at the beginning or the amount 20 years, 30 years down the road? Barring inflation, all that, just trying to understand.
So the developer has prepared a spreadsheet, and the $100,000 or $150,000 is in day one, and then there's an inflationary factor. So there's basically an assumption that's made in inflation, and that number increases each year. And then there's also the option to do the same thing with the local area service, for instance, to take into account.
I know the inflationary aspect, but it's going to be a 20-year-old structure in 20 years. It's likely going to take more and more, like there's a bell curve as opposed to just an inflationary addition every year.
Yeah, so my understanding is for elements of the structure that have a finite service life, say a concrete has a 100-year service life, you take the value of that and you say it depreciates at 1% per year, and then you basically are contributing to a reserve so that you can ultimately pay for its replacement or repair at the end of the service life. And I believe that is taken into account in that operations and maintenance number.
Yeah, back to Doug's point. Can you bring up the slide that shows our tax implications for the different there was another one that had a different,
That's the total cost.
At each, okay, there it is. Show the residential impact on homes. That's one we have to sell to the public. Like industrial, 100 a year, depending on what we got. A house, 400 a year, depending on what we got.
So just to clarify, it's 417 just in the local service
Yeah.
area, 378 plus 38.
Right.
Yes.
So you pay taxation, but you'd also have
The general tax.
parcel tax.
Well, that's it. Anyway,
Yeah,
well,
Local
that's good.
services.
That makes me feel better. I thought, I was looking at,
General population.
378 is only for the new development, correct?
Yes.
And
The general taxation is what would be applicable to the rest of Squamish, which is 38 on average per home.
well, I mean, it's getting up there. I mean, light industrial and business other have been crying pretty loudly this last tax flip. Anyway,
It's a tax increase, yes.
yeah, so, you know, to Doug's point on originally telling the public that this, you know, and then coming back with that is, you know, there's gonna be more people at the public house.
Yeah, just back to Ms. Matthews' point about the reserve being designated if it comes from LAS versus not if it comes from general taxation. So under that formula, the local service area, this is the 50-50 share, in effect in their 378, they are paying half the cost of the reserve because general taxation is picking up the other half. Does that force the reserve to be just for this single purpose? Or does the fact that general taxation is contributing to it allow it to be used for other purposes?
So there are some things that I will need to research more with the ministry as we close this down as to what it really looks like. However, and this originally was brought to finance as a 50-50 split, period, and we costed everything based on just all those costs and then 50-50 split. As I was doing that, I kind of went, I don't know that we really want to have such a heavy emphasis on a very specified reserve coming from a local area. So what I would suggest, and if council agrees with that concern, then what we would do is actually split the costs, and the local area service would bylaw would only be structured to manage the O&M, and we would restructure our financial policies to start building this emergency reserve totally distinct from the local area service. Would be, in my opinion, a possibly more flexible strategic approach.
As long as we were building the reserve, not the grade we need to build.
That's right. Now, that's a risk, as you know, future councils may not have that same sense of responsibility. So it's something definitely to weigh up. And what I was just also threw on the table was, once we have that all hazards reserve, I think we could sell it to the ministry that just contributing a small component to that reserve from the local area service is because they heightened the risk by building this new structure, but then we could potentially still use that reserve more fulsomely. So I think there's some options I can take back to the ministry to work out what would be reasonable in that interpretation of the legislation.
And where does this formula get enshrined going forward? Whatever we come to settle on. Is it in a zoning bylaw? Is it in an agreement with somebody? Is it a covenant on the land? Can a future council come along and say, oh, the heck with it, we're just going to change the numbers?
Bylaws are always open to council. And my understanding, and I am not the expert in local area services, please don't suggest that I am, but when you put the local area service bylaw in place, it is a bylaw specific to that, and you have to be very prescriptive about what you're collecting funds for and how you're determining that, how you're calculating it. So the O&M portion would be prescribed that way, and the form of taxation would be done by that bylaw. With how your agreements are development, I'm going to step away and let these gentlemen answer in terms of how we get the bridging dollar value from the developer until we have all the units and the LAS.
Well, on that end, just, I mean, if it was 50-50, for example, the 50-50 split going forward, just on the costs that we can show here, where does that get enshrined? Does it show up in the zoning bylaw, or is it?
I think the local service area bylaw would capture the O&M costs, and the province has to approve that bylaw. So any changes to that bylaw would then have to go back to the province. So there's a bit of a stop.
A bit of a stop.
There. The rest of it, the reserve building, that would be again in I'm assuming a reserve bylaw that would set it out, but it wouldn't live in a zoning bylaw. And the land development agreement, I think, that could only go as far as, you know, making sure that that developer contribution is secured until the build out. Yeah.
Chris?
Sorry, if I can just clarify, I think that staff are kind of moving away from the idea of a 50-50 split into O&M cost goes in one bylaw in the local service area, and the reserve building goes into from general taxation into a reserve, which would have terms on it. So the 50-50 split actually doesn't get enshrined. Coincidentally, we started off with a 50-50 idea in our head based on the last council meeting. And then coincidentally, when we broke out the numbers, we discovered that actually annual O&M and the reserve building are roughly the same amount. But I don't think it would enshrine a percentage. We would simply enshrine maintenance out of one source and reserve building out of a different source.
So the only option.
So I'm anticipating that as part of the provincial approval for the actual mitigation structure, that they're going to say, you know, the District of Squamish is going to be the diking authority. We're going to be responsible for operations and maintenance, and that includes debris clean out. And right now we're seeking some assurance from the province that disaster financial assistance would be available. That means they provide 80%, we provide 20%. So they're going to be looking for certainty that we are doing our part to build up the reserve to cover that 20%. And that may be a condition of the approval by the province. So that may be some of the motivation or what's sort of binding us to make sure that we're building up that adequate reserve. And I'm not sure what form that legal agreement takes. It's the form of approval. Beyond that, I don't know, but I'm sure that the province is going to require certainty that we are building up adequate reserves to maintain our piece of that.
Christine, do you want to add to that, or?
I'm okay. I was just going to indicate that you could, if you wanted to enshrine it, it would be in the local area service with the O&M and the reserve being together, and then splitting it 50-50. I think that probably complicates the use of the reserve.
Karen?
Sorry, my point was the same as David's. I don't think we can go and sit down with the province unless we can commit and demonstrate that we're doing our part.
And
And
that's the
backstop
whole.
it if we're future council might back up. So I do think we need to,
Like a mechanism that could.
yeah, lock it down.
Yeah. Moving first. I love the one big unquantifiable thing is predictability of council in the future. Unlike debris flows, we got lots of, there's no measure for
There's
it.
probably not a probability calculator.
I'll stop there. Doug.
So, back to this area where this stuff might end up, that I cycle by a couple of times a week actually, so I'm a little sensitive to that, but it just, a couple of things occur to me going forward if this unfolded in that fashion. One is, we're going to be the diking authority, then presumably we'd be extending our boundaries to capture the barrier, because I believe right now it's not in the district. And I'll leave it to staff to consider whether we would also extend our boundaries around this other area at the same time. And then the other practical thing that just occurs to me is that normally when you see these pieces logged, pretty soon afterwards somebody comes along and replants them, and you can't dump stuff in the growing forest. So does that mean it gets left sort of bare, and with all the issues around erosion and everything that caused? So there's just a few, I guess, the kind of picky little mechanical things that I'm sort of wondering about. Not deal breakers, but just how that might actually unfold. If that's actually going to be the spot that we might want to dump some stuff on one day. And who has to consent to that? Are we also going to be talking to forestry, Ministry of Forests, around that?
Has that conversation happened at all?
No, I think the next step would be, once we identify those sites and we go through the agreements, everything's signed, I think we would then look for, as part of those agreements, to be securing tenure for the district for those sites.
Yeah, so we've already actually started to, the province is already in the process of putting a restriction on that particular site for this particular. So, is it Flint?
That started, okay.
Flint, that work's already sort of underway.
Anything else, Jonas? Any other slides?
No, just looking for an indication that we're good to go to bring it back for 2 readings and scheduling.
You have some.
Well, I was just wondering, before that, are you coming back with any other thoughts or suggestions or recommendations?
I think we could do that at the first and second reading on the OCP.
On the 12th?
Yeah.
On the 12th.
I know it's taken us a long time to get here, but I also know that this proposal was quite different than what we went to public hearing with last time. And I'm curious about whether we would do first and second reading together, or give the community an opportunity to comment after first reading, but we still have an opportunity to maybe massage things.
So the land use hasn't changed from the first time around. It's the details around the mitigation maintenance that are changing. But in terms of land use, what we held the public hearing on it's all still the same for the zoning bylaw and the OCP.
I understand that, but the Citizens Council has made a decision that we'll split the cost now, and that's a very new thing. And what if we made potentially the wrong call? And so sometimes when we get as far as public hearing, it's very difficult to go back and make some adjustments. So anyway, I'm just wondering about the wisdom of doing first and second readings together, even though the land use hasn't changed. But we are suggesting that people's taxes will be increased for.
Is there a possibility of bringing first reading on the 5th?
I think it's
We will be bringing forward the adoption of the new OCP on the 5th, and optically, it kind of, it's an optics.
You think a week later really makes a difference?
I think we could explore it. I have a suspicion that we have a big agenda
We have a huge
on the 5th, so something would have to get shifted around.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Well, the other thing, for my purposes, it would be just as good if it came back to a committee on the 5th. Something before we actually get the bylaw typed up, so we have a chance to, as Councilor Elliott points out, to massage it. And if that would be a possibility.
Yeah, like a draft of the bylaw at either CDC or me and the board or something on the 5th. Just sort of like, here's what the bylaw's looking, so the public can have a real understanding.
Or council.
Oh, council. Touche. Well, we've, at this point, I think Councilor Elliott makes a good point in that this is brand new to the public. I know it's brand new to council, but we're sitting here around the table today digesting it. So I think the sooner we get some real meat around the first reading of the bylaw, understanding, get that into the public on the 5th, so at least in committee, but then consider first and second reading potentially together. Council can always decide based on feedback, based on whatever, that we only do first reading, but that's council's prerogative on the day.
Yes, we can bring it back to the committee as a draft bylaw.
Oh, now he's angry.
Done it twice.
Get him.
I got bitten at the last council meeting.
Did you?
Yeah, at the public hearing, I got bitten in the foot.
That was the one you got angry in here just before you came in.
That's right. I didn't realize you had money to serve that fight.
I need a coffee now. A Band-Aid.
Okay, do you think you have enough to come back with sort of a draft bylaw on the 5th for committee to have a look at?
Yes,
And then we'll.
we have enough.
Great. John, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think the only thing that, if you go back to the slide where you just talked about the operations maintenance reserve fund, you know, as we continue to move this thing forward, and we're talking about what merits bringing this back to a public hearing, that's it's a bit scary for us because this process as we're moving it forward is not a cheap endeavor, which is why we want some security, but we're understanding that we got to get the community security as well. And so if, just taking this $920,000 number, if insurance come back and it's $10,000 less, okay, fine, I don't think we need to go back to public hearing, but what happens if insurance is $10,000 less and debris clean out is $10,000 more than we think, right? All these are a bit fungible, they're in the air, we don't know the exact numbers, but if we're fine tuning this and we find out that the number overall is around that $920,000 number, that to me is sort of saying, that's what we all discussed, that's what everyone's kind of pushing forward, whether or not it's, $100,000 in insurance is now 110 or 90, I'm worried
If
that.
it's in the ballpark, I think, I'm looking at to Robin to clarify, but I think it's reasonable, it's in the
Yeah.
ballpark. That's why I suggest that the numbers that are included in this are conservative, they're almost like the top end of the possibility.
Yeah.
So that if it's reduced, we don't have to go back to public hearing. The public has the opportunity to consider essentially the worst case scenario as part of this. There's a risk in doing that too. People go, that's crazy, that's too much, but it saves us from having to go back to public hearing.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. Yeah.
And it sounds like these are theoretically close to the top end anyway, so.
Yeah, we were pretty conservative in what we were putting together.
Okay. Sounds good? You
Thank
don't
you.
need a motion from us, you do need a motion from us.
Yes, although we're coming back for another
Yeah, I don't think
committee
we need
meeting.
this motion, I think,
I don't think we need it.
yeah, I think this restricts your ability
Yeah.
to put this motion forward, so.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Chief Perry, you good? Okay. We don't have a delegation, so I'm looking for a motion to terminate.
I'll send you a message.
Jonas, do we have a motion on the university to consider?
Yes, we have one motion that's pretty simple. I mean, you could do a motion about directing staff to initiate a bylaw preparation for alignment of zoning bylaw at the University Heights with the sub-area plan.
So can you read that out for me?
That staff initiate the preparation of a zoning bylaw amendment to better align the zoning at university lands with the Sea to Sky University sub-area plan.
Okay, anyone want to move that?
Does that put a slowdown on?
We might come back with a slightly finer motion.
Okay.
We're going to go back and check to make sure that it hits that point.
Moved?
Second.
Seconded by Councilor, seconded by Councilor Kent. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries. Motion to terminate. Moved by Peter, seconded by Ted. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries.